It's Monday, August 12th, 2019. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm speaking today with Mr. Bob Irvin here at his home in Atlanta. Bob served multiple non-consecutive terms in the Georgia House of Representatives, first from 1973 until 1978, and again from 1995 and until 2002. During that period, he served as House Minority Leader. We'll touch on several subjects today, but we'll spend most of our time discussing the 1990s, a pivotal period in Georgia politics. Thanks again, Bob, for talking with me again. Thanks for Lynn also for hosting.
Glad to have you here.
I really do appreciate it. So I wonder if we could begin. Tell us again briefly who you are, where you came from, and how you came to be where you are today.
I grew up in Roswell. My father was a country veterinarian, and as far as I remember, we were the only people in Roswell in 1956 with Eisenhower bumper stickers. So the first thing I ever did was circulate petitions for Barry Goldwater to run for president in 1963. And then I was the president of the Young Republican Club at my college, William & Mary in Virginia, and I was the state chairman of the Young Republicans here in Georgia. And as the state chairman, I went around the state trying to get people to run for office. And while I was doing that, they did the reapportionment session in 1971, and my home ended up in an open district, open house district. Mm-hmm. And so I just decided that I ought to take my own advice, and I'd been trying to get people to run. I ought to take my own advice and run myself. So I ran and got elected in 1972. I've always been more interested in policy than in politics, and I ran for office really because that was the main way to put yourself in a position to be able to affect public policy. Mm-hmm. There are other ways, and over the years I've found some other ways. I was at McKinsey for 15 years, and I was on the team that did the original design of the Georgia Research Alliance. And so, you know, in some ways, maybe that's the most important policy contribution I've ever made. But the reason that I ran was to be in a position to influence policy.
So, in 1973, remind me how many Republicans were in that caucus? 29.
29. Which was the high point for 20 years.
Right. So you came in and remind us what the Georgia House of Representatives was like in 1973, because that's an important distinction because of the way the House would change after the death of Speaker George L. Smith.
Well, as you suggest, the Speaker was George L. Smith. He was the speaker who had organized the independent legislature movement in the late 60s. Before then, the House had been dominated by the governor. The speaker had been appointed by the governor. So George L. Smith was the first speaker in a long time who was independently elected by the House, and he was still the speaker in 1973. In some ways, actually, it was kind of the last of the old style legislatures, I think, the last of the old style House memberships. George L. Smith had been first elected in 1944. The person who'd been there the longest, Judge Roy McCracken, who was still the chairman of the Insurance Committee, had been elected in 1937. So there were a lot of people who'd been there a long time. There was this crazy quilt of districts that had been designed to preserve white Democratic dominance. And so you had 2-member districts and 3-member districts and 4-member districts.
Yeah, post 1, post 2, post 3, post 4.
And it was all designed to preserve the dominance of the white Democrats. And there were 2 women in the House at the time. Both of them were black. There, as you said, there are 151 Democrats and 29 Republicans. There were committees that had very arcane names. There was a State of the Republic Committee, which was the Governmental Affairs Committee. If you had a bill about the Fulton County government, for example, we'd go to the State of the Republic Committee. But it was called that because before the Civil War, it was the committee that annually reported on whether Georgia should secede. But it's still called the State of the Republic Committee. And there was what's now the Regulated Beverages Committee was the Temperance Committee. And there was
certainly a committee of its time.
Right. And what's now the Transportation Committee was the Highways Committee.
Sure.
So, a lot of things that were sort of old style in the legislature in 1973. And Republicans were, individually, you were treated well. The ethos, once you get down there, is sort of, there are no Democrats here and no Republicans. We're just all individual members trying to serve our districts, which wasn't exactly true. Republicans, I always said the Republicans got to use the Speaker's Xerox machine, but Democrats got to be chairman of things. So, no Republican had ever been a committee chairman or a committee officer even.
Right.
People who came in with me, Democrats, as soon as they got there, they were officers of the committees.
Even as freshmen.
Yeah, even as first week members, they were officers of committees, and so you had no real chance to advance as a Republican, and you had the ability to pass what I call private bills. So things having to do with lawsuits and and you had a chance to have an impact on local bills, but on really big state policy issues, those were all dominated by the Democratic leadership, which was George L. Smith, George Busbee, who was the majority leader, and a few others. Sloppy Floyd, who was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee.
And the Speaker Pro Tem, who was Tom Murphy.
Tom Murphy was the Speaker Pro Tem. Tom wasn't really part of that group.
Correct.
It was kind of interesting. Tom had been Lester Maddox's floor leader. And so, I don't even know where he stood in the debate about an independent legislature, but he was not part of the George L. Smith, George Busbee, Sloppy Floyd group.
Where Murphy came down in that meeting, the caucus meeting after 66, 67, was he had chose to run for majority leader and lost by a handful of votes to George Busbee. And so he came up short, and I believe the Speaker Pro Tem at the time was an older fellow from maybe Floyd County, maybe up in Dalton, who passed away. And so Speaker Murphy assumed the Speaker Pro Tem's position because of somebody passing away, and then assumed the speakership when George L. Succumbed to his stroke. So tell me about that transition period. You had one legislative session under George L. Smith, and then George L. Has a stroke,
Early December.
73.
Yeah, he had a stroke in early December, Sunday morning, in 1973, and he lingered for maybe 2 weeks, several days anyway. And that was very much to Tom Murphy's benefit, because Murphy, as the Speaker Pro Tem, had to kind of assume the mantle of getting ready for the session. December is a heavy preparation time for the General Assembly session, and he was in a natural position to do that. It seemed like the natural thing to do. Nobody could criticize him for things he would do to get ready for the session, and everybody was kind of frozen in place by the fact, first, that George L. lingered, and then after the funeral there was a decent interval before you're going to start campaigning for Speaker. And as a result, by the time the session came around, Murphy had his hand on all the levers of power, and nobody was in a position to challenge him. I've always thought that if George L. had had a heart attack and died immediately, that there might have been a different result. Somebody might have run against him that year, but he didn't. He lingered, and so Tom Murphy was in a position to become the speaker in all but name. Somebody had to do the work, so nobody could complain about it.
Right.
And by the time the session started, there he was.
So, what role? I think asking questions about succession, as you noted while he lingered, seemed unseemly. But was there any discussion among Republicans in the Republican caucus of trying to influence the race one way or the other?
A little bit, though. I think everybody knew we really couldn't influence it. I mean, on the plane back from George L. Smith's funeral, I had the chance to talk about it a little bit to Ben Brown, who was one of the leaders of the Black Caucus. And I mean, I was saying, Ben, might you think about voting for Al Burris? And he said, well, I really like Al. So, who knows what might have happened if there'd been more time. But I don't think anybody on the Republican side really thought we were going to have a voice in it. It was going to be decided in the Democratic caucus.
And Al Burris did challenge Tom Murphy in the Democratic caucus.
He did in 76, I guess,
right.
After the 76 election.
76.
Yeah. And I think he was one of the people that thought about
right.
running against Murphy in 73. The person who really had the opportunity, if he had wanted to be Speaker of the House, was George Busbee. I mean, he had been George L.'s main lieutenant, and he really had sort of come to the conclusion that George L. Smith was going to be Speaker of the House forever, which is what George L. wanted also.
Oh, sure.
So he had in 73, he'd started lining up his support to run for governor. And he was well down the road of getting people committed to support him for governor. Even so, I think in December when George L. Smith died, I mean, there was a pause where George Busbee thought about whether he was really going to run for governor or whether he was going to get out of the governor's race and run for speaker. And he could have been elected speaker. I mean, there would have been no doubt about that. But he was the only person that was sort of in that position.
Well, and I guess you have to hand it to George Busbee because at the time, it was not a clear. There were no clear indications that he was going to be elected governor.
That's true.
Of course, with Lester Maddox.
It worked out right for him, but it was, there were 4 or 5 strong candidates in that Democratic primary for governor, and it wasn't clear that he was going to be the one who was going to emerge. So the safer choice would have been to back out and run for speaker. But I think he had spent a lot of time and energy, lining up support and probably felt some commitment to those people too who'd gone out on a limb to be for him.
Well, this is sort of playing the what if game, but how would that, in your experience working with George Busbee, how might have the experience been different than in that period with Speaker Murphy?
Well, they're completely different personalities. I mean, George Busbee is much closer in personality to George L. Smith in the sense that, he wanted to win and he would twist arms and, do what he had to do to win. But he was always nice to people and civil, so, even when he was telling you no, you felt okay about it because he was nice to you. And George L. Smith, in presiding in the House, was always courteous and polite to everybody. And Tom Murphy was completely the opposite. I mean, his sort of demeanor was to insult people from the rostrum and just to say ugly things about people. So he was just a completely different personality than George L. Smith and then George Busbee. And I think frankly, for a lot of people in the 70s, the legislature would have been a lot more fun if George Busbee had been the speaker than if Tom Murphy had been speaker.
So I came across something in Zell Miller's papers the other day. It's a photo of Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, giving an address to what appeared to be a joint session. And it looked like it was in October, so this wouldn't have been a traditional legislative session. Did you attend?
Yeah, I did. It was actually a mock session.
A mock session.
And the reason it was a mock session was so they wouldn't have to pay per diem to all the members, because the law, I guess, is if you have a special session, you have to pay people. And you add up the payments for the legislators and the staffs and the expenses, and everything. It adds up to a significant amount. So it was a mock session. You were invited to come, but on your own nickel, so to speak, which was fine. I mean, nobody complained about it, but that's what it was there. And we'd gotten all these protocol instructions ahead of time. Do not try to shake the prince's hand. The royal family does not shake hands, so don't do this. And the funny thing that sticks in my mind about it is that there was one of the TV stations in Atlanta had purported to find some sort of romantic interest on the prince's part in the governor's daughter, Governor Busbee. Polite, the prince stayed at the governor's mansion, and so this was actually on the news as speculation, but is there some romantic interest on the part of the prince with the governor's daughter? Obviously completely made up, but that was the thing that was the talk of the Capitol the day of the mock session.
The one thing I read in the Constitution was that some of the Speaker Murphy wasn't necessarily impressed by the speaker, but he went out of his way to change and make sure there was fresh sand in all the ashtray.
Is that right? I remember that. Don't have ashtrays down there anymore.
No. Times have changed just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing about the early '70s. You ask what was the house like in '73? A lot of smoking in the house and a lot of ashtrays. There was a guy who sat right in front of me, a guy named George Petro, who was a Republican from DeKalb County. George smoked these big smelly cigars.
Oh, God.
And he would turn around and put his cigar out in my ashtray. He wouldn't use his ashtray, but he'd turn around and he'd reach over and use my ashtray. Al Burris was actually the guy that passed the bill to stop smoking in the House, which it was a lobbying effort that had been started by Betty Lowe, Tom Lowe's wife, and a friend of hers. I can't remember who the friend was, but the two of them just set out in maybe '75 or '76 to get the House to outlaw smoking in the chamber, and they were down there every day just lobbying about it, and they got the support of a lot of people. But the guy who was important that they got support of was Al Burris. And I always remember Al. I mean, Al died of lung cancer because Al was a heavy
That's
smoker.
what I was about to say. There's a
smoker.
sense of irony there.
Yeah, a lot of irony. He went to the well and he said, this is really, probably ironic that I'm probably the heaviest smoker in here, but I'm seriously in favor of this bill. And he actually passed it. I mean, that was really the reason it passed.
You mentioned Betty Lowe. There was an old Republican in the 5th District, Atlanta, named Wyman Lowe.
Wyman Sela.
Wyman Sela, who is
he was
a character.
He was a Democrat.
One of those gadfly.
He was a Democrat. He ran as a Republican. One election, I think.
It was sometime in the 70s, maybe 76.
I mean, the situation in the 70s, in the 60s and the 70s for Republicans is that there were a lot of offices that you couldn't actually find anybody to run for because you didn't have a chance to win. And so what would happen is, up until the last day of qualifying, nobody would have qualified for Congress in this case as a Republican. And so somebody would then just sort of wander in off the street on the theory that they wouldn't have a primary, they could be the Republican candidate, and maybe magic would hit. And that was Wyman Sela. Wyman Sela had run for Congress, certainly for Congress, several times as a Democrat. Never got through the primary. And so then in maybe 74, he just, the Republican line was vacant on the last day of qualifying, and he came in to qualify, and he saw that it was open, and he said, well, why not me? So,
well, that was
he was no relation to Tom Lowe or to Betty Lowe. That's probably where
to the point. But that was a similar situation to. Now, this would have been your transition period up to Harvard Business School, but that year, 1978's gubernatorial election, the party had to change the rules. So party chairman Rodney Cook could run for governor, because if they didn't, I think that it was Uncle Bud Harley, who was Bill Shipp would later call him a doodah or something. would be the top of the ticket. So they had to change the rules just so a serious candidate could run.
Yeah, I mean, all the people who were legislative candidates or down the ballot candidates would always were fearful of having somebody like that at the top of the ticket, because obviously it would depress the Republican vote, and it would have an effect on votes down the ballot. And we'd all been through the experience in '74 of having Ronnie Thompson be the Republican nominee, which was a very I mean, it was almost as bad as Watergate in terms of its effect on Republican voters, because
really?
Nobody that I knew in the Republican Party was actually for Ronnie Thompson. I mean, everybody that knew him knew he was really certifiably crazy. I mean, at one point near the end of his term in Macon, he just sort of disappeared, and it was found that he was living out in the woods in a pup tent somehow. I mean, this is the guy who ended up as our nominee for governor in 1974, and it was a real ball and chain to drag around with you that year. And so nobody wanted that to happen again, and so that's why Rodney was willing to run as clearly a sacrificial lamb, but a respectable sacrificial lamb.
So that's a good segue to talk about a period in the party's history where we can really talk about an effort to modernize the party, because in the 1970s, as you mentioned, Ronnie Thompson, Watergate, Jimmy Carter rising to prominence, dragging down Georgia Republicans. You went to Harvard Business School between 78 and 81?
Graduated in 80, yeah, 78 to 80. Right.
So you were back in Georgia for the 81 convention cycle, after Mack had been elected senator.
Right.
Tell me about that convention cycle and working with Paul Coverdell and Mack Mattingly and Newt Gingrich to try and install new leadership, or elect new leadership rather,
right.
In the party.
So Paul and Newt and John Linder and I had all been part of Mack Mattingly's long-range planning committee when he was the state chairman. And if there's a moment when the modern Republican Party was created, I think that was it. We set out to try to reinvent the image of the party, and I think we did that. But perhaps the more important thing was that we sort of all found each other, and became really a team that all of us were involved in Republican Party politics for 25 years after that. So Mack had been the chairman from 75 to 77. Then Rodney had been the chairman from 77 to 79. And then in 79, I was in Massachusetts in 79, but in 79, Matthew Patton got elected state chairman on the strength of being for Ronald Reagan for president in 1980. He sort of got the local Reagan organization to back him. And that was sort of the old style, actually, of the way that people got elected Republican Party chairman, is what presidential candidates are for, right? And,
right.
As opposed to what you can accomplish in
that
state.
Goes way back, yeah.
Yeah, that's the old style. So, but Matthew got elected in 79, and then Mack Mattingly got elected to the U.S. Senate in 1980. Did not think that Matthew had done much to help him. I think that's right. I think, to the extent that Matthew was involved at all, it was in the Reagan presidential campaign, not in Mattingly's race. And so then Mattingly, having gotten elected, naturally wanted to have somebody who was his guy in charge of the party. And so they found Fred Cooper, and Fred, it was in the end a pretty close race. I don't remember the vote at the state convention, but there were a number of places around the state where there were battles along the way, and one of the battles was in Fulton County. It was who was the Fulton County delegation to the state convention going to be. Biggest delegation of any county in the state, of course. And so there was a battle in the Fulton County convention between Matthew and Matthew's supporters. I mean, he was a Fulton County guy, so he was there himself.
Sure.
And people who were for Fred Cooper. And so I was involved in the planning of that, and we decided that I should be the person who would be the convention chairman, because you always want the convention chairman to be on your side, right?
Absolutely.
You want to make sure the rulings are fair, right? in your favor. And so we got to the convention, and Matthew had searched around for somebody to be his candidate for convention chairman, and it turned out that it was Fletcher Thompson. He decided that Fletcher was going to be his candidate that day, I think. And Fletcher hadn't known that he was going to run, and Fletcher's a dear friend of mine. And so Fletcher came up to me before the vote and sort of apologized for opposing me for convention chairman, but he did, because he was for Matthew and I was for Fred. And it was a pretty close election for convention chairman. I want to say maybe out of 700 votes cast, maybe there was a margin of 50 or something like that. So it was a closely divided convention, but we won.
So this looks like Jack Sells was the incumbent county chairman.
Yeah, you wrote that. I didn't remember that, but that may be right. Yeah, Jack was for Fred, and
Harold Dye.
Harold Dye, I guess, was Matthew's candidate. Yeah.
Who, funnily enough, was, I believe, the runoff opponent against Machine Gun Ronnie Thompson back in 1974.
He was. I mean, these were all respectable people, right? I mean, Harold was, I certainly voted for Harold in the runoff against Ronnie Thompson, and most people I knew did. And I really thought Harold would win, but he didn't have a long history with the party. He didn't know anybody really, and so he didn't win. We'd have been a lot better off if he'd been the nominee for governor in '74. He would have lost, of course. But But he would have been respectable, and he wouldn't have turned so many Republican voters off.
Mm-hmm. So you were actually a leader of Operation Breakthrough, which would have been you, John Linder, Nolan Murrow.
Yeah, Nolan was actually the guy who pulled it together. Nolan was one of the leading Republicans for years and years in Columbus. Mm-hmm. And Nolan had been the national committee man for one term or maybe a term and a half. And Nolan was another guy who was a dear friend of mine. And so Operation Breakthrough was really an extra party attempt, if you will, to do things that the party really should have done or that the legislative leadership should have done, which is to recruit candidates, give them things to talk about, raise money for campaigns. The party sort of delegated this to Operation Breakthrough, which did a better job than the party would have done if they were doing it by themselves. It wasn't in opposition to the party. I mean, Fred thought this was a good idea, but it was Nolan that really drove it. John Linder was deeply involved. I was deeply involved. There were a number of other people I can't remember for sure. I think Larry Thompson, I don't know if you remember Larry Thompson, was
attorney
from the Northern District. I think Larry was one of the people on the group. It was really Nolan's group.
So help me understand why, if Operation Breakthrough had the blessing of the party, had the support of the party, why it remained outside and apart from the state GOP.
I think the Fred and Bob Bell, who was the chairman after him, just didn't have the party didn't have the strength to do this. And Nolan was doing it as a sort of extra party effort. And it's hard to remember the kind of situation we were dealing with in those days. I mean, I always remember Nolan was the general counsel of Royal Crown Cola. Mm-hmm. And he recruited the CEO of Royal Crown Cola, whose name I can't remember, to do a fundraiser for Operation Breakthrough for Republican candidates. That was the only CEO in the state whose attention we could get. I mean, you couldn't get the CEO of Southern Company, the CEO of Coca-Cola, the CEO of any other company in the state to be willing to put their name on the line for a Republican fundraiser. And so Nolan was very proud. We were all very proud and we had hoped that maybe by getting him involved that would give us an entree to other CEOs in the state, but that never happened.
Whatever happened to Operation Breakthrough? It seemed like it was sort of a 1982 to 84 operation.
It sort of ran its course. I mean, it was the Nolan's idea was that Reagan was going to win big in '84, and that we ought to try to be in a position to ride Reagan's coattails. And so we elected, 5 or 6 new legislative members, I think.
That sounds about right.
Which was, percentage-wise, a big deal. We didn't elect all the seats that we went after, but the thing that I did on that was I did a lot of research, and I was really sort of in charge of the issues and the research, and this was to give the candidates talking points.
Right.
And the thing that I discovered by looking in the Book of the States, which is the official publication of the National Council of State Legislatures, was that Georgia had more public employees per capita than any other state in the Southeast. More public employees per capita, in fact, than Massachusetts had. And you think Massachusetts would be the most prolific state of the country. But the value of that fact and of other similar facts was for Republican candidates to be able to prove that the Democrats really weren't conservatives. I mean, the Democrats all tried to, tell the voters that they were as conservative as the Republicans. And on some issues, of course, they were, but not on spending issues. And so that fact and other facts became a key talking point for our candidates, even for us. I mean, I remember John Linder telling me that he was astonished that this was the case, the public employee number, because he had sort of half believed himself when Tom Murphy and those guys would all say, well, we're fiscal conservatives. He'd sort of half believed it himself, but then you really start digging into it, you discover it isn't true. So that was one of the main talking points we gave him, and it helped elect some candidates. And
it sounds like that's a line that sort of runs throughout your career, which is even during the long range planning committee, your position was we need to have issues to run on. So it was part of your job to generate those issues and ideas to make, to draw a contrast with Democrats, to give Republican voters something to vote for. What were you hoping to achieve by putting out those talking points?
Well, first of all, it goes back to the point I made at the beginning. I mean, my interest from the very beginning in this has been policy. And I got into politics so I could affect policy. So it was a natural thing for me to do to look at these. The political purpose of these things, of course, was to try to draw a contrast between us and the Democrats, and to give our candidates some points to make that were factual points.
Right.
It's a lot of people, I think, don't think about this, but a lot of first-time candidates really don't know what to talk about. I mean, they don't really know the facts of what's going on at the Capitol. They certainly don't know the ins and outs of issues. And one of the main things that you can do to help them in races, you can raise money, certainly. You can target districts that you think you have a chance of winning. But one of the main things you can do for them is give them something to talk about. And so what we were trying to do was give them conservative points to make, so that you could say something beyond "I'm a conservative" and this other guy's not, because he'd just say back, "Well, I am too." So
right.
So that was the political purpose of it, was to try to draw the distinction and give candidates something to talk about.
So in the House at this time, Minority Leader is Johnny Isakson, who is currently the senior senator from Georgia. There was a beef with Johnny Isakson that he wasn't necessarily confrontational enough or willing to draw enough of those contrasts. Yeah. What was your obviously you weren't in the House at the time, but you were a bystander looking in.
While I was out at McKinsey Business School and so But I mean, I followed it, and I obviously knew Johnny because I had served with Johnny in the
Right.
70s. Yes, that was Mel Steele wrote a paper about the history of the Republican Party, which you had referenced, and Mel made the point that there was one side of the caucus led by John Linder that thought that we ought to be more agenda-driven and more partisan, drawing distinctions with the Democrats in order to win elections. And that won Johnny. I mean, Johnny was very much I think in that faction's view, sort of a go along to get along guy. I mean, the phrase that you would hear from people is Johnny's got feathers on his legs. Means he's chicken. And so, there was that criticism of him. And he, to his credit, he lasted 4 terms as the minority leader. But there was that criticism. And really almost according to Mel's paper, there was a pretty severe split in the caucus.
So I think a lot of people, when they look at Johnny Isakson and look back, they sort of lump him in or see him as part and parcel of the Mattingly, Coverdell, Cooper wing of the party. Was he part of that group?
I wouldn't say so. He was on their side, I think.
Okay.
As against Matthew Patton, for example. But Johnny was never part of that group, part of the leadership of that group. I mean, Paul and John and Newt and me and a few other people, Nolan, Bob Bell. I mean, we were all sort of a group. Johnny was not really part of that group. He wasn't on the other side, but he was never really part of the group.
I see. So 1986, there was some speculation that you would run for governor in 1986. And this is too good of a quote not to read into the record from Bill Shipp. It says, Bob Irvin is evidently the last hope of the GOP in fielding a substantial candidate against Joe Frank Harris. Oh, some doodah clutching a pauper's oath and wearing a beanie with a propeller on it will finally come forward to run for governor as a Republican. Therein lies the problem of the Republican Party of Georgia.
Yeah, well, this was sort of saying Wyman Sela is going to come run for governor, which Wyman Sela may not have still been alive in '86. I'm not sure, but that kind of person. After the Operation Breakthrough effort, Nolan Murrow had encouraged me to think about running for governor, and so I did think about it. It was not something that looked in the end to be plausible, and so I didn't do it. But I did think about it, yeah.
There's been some talk, and people I've interviewed suggested that there was a gentleman's agreement between Mac Mattingly's campaign and Joe Frank Harris that if the Republicans didn't field a gubernatorial candidate, Joe Frank would not campaign hard against Mac Mattingly, and that was the agreement. And obviously, it fell through because. Fellow Davis. Guy Davis ended up running in 1986.
I went to law school with Guy Davis, actually.
Oh, really? Really? Yeah. Well, that's
right.
right.
Guy was not a doodah, right?
No.
Guy was...
he was more of a gadfly than a doodah.
Yeah, I mean, Guy was an okay candidate. I mean, he wasn't Wyman Sela.
Right. Few people are.
Right. No, what you allude to, that was a Republican fantasy.
Okay.
I mean, the actual fantasy was that if there was no Republican candidate for governor, that Joe Frank Harris would block any Democrat from running against Mac, or at least any Democrat who was, had a chance to win.
Right.
And I mean, I don't know whether Joe Frank Harris led him to believe that or not. That's possible. He didn't have the power to deliver on that.
Sure.
I mean, he didn't get Weichfowler in the race. Weichfowler got himself in the race, and so did the other people who were candidates in that primary. But it was a Republican fantasy to think that that if we didn't nominate somebody for governor, that there wouldn't be a Democratic challenge to Mac Mattingly. But it was a fantasy that was widely believed. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't run for governor was that Haley Barbour, who was then working at the White House, explained it to me. I mean, in the way that politicians explain things. I mean, he explained it to me. And, if I ran for governor and that was then blamed for a strong Democrat beating Mac Mattingly, then, I would never have I'd never eat lunch in this town again, right? I mean, that was, it was a widely believed fantasy and believed right up to the White House. But Joe Frank Harris, even if he wanted to, couldn't deliver on his end.
Right. So you eventually, you do get back into politics in 1990. Hard-fought Republican primary, and I think we've talked about this before. We talked about it the first time. You came up just short against Dorothy Felton.
Right.
And I believe the main issue in that campaign was the Sandy Springs Incorporation bill.
Yeah, which had been Dorothy's issue for 15 years. Every year she proposed it and couldn't get it passed. I mean, no particular slam on Dorothy for not being able to get it passed. The odds were stacked against her. It became a partisan issue. It became a racial issue. It never should have been either one of those things, but it did. And so Tom Murphy, kept killing it. But Sally Newbill, the Senate was different. Sally Newbill was the senator at the time, and the process for getting local bills passed is that you have to win the vote in the local delegation, and then the second step is you have to carry the bill around and get it to be signed by a majority of the members of the delegation. So it's a two-step process. It's not eligible to be signed by the majority of the delegation unless it wins the vote. But then if it does win the vote and you don't get the signatures, you still can't pass it.
Okay.
That's the way it works. And so what happened was that Sally actually got the City of Sandy Springs bill, her City of Sandy Springs bill, past the delegation in the Senate. And she was then carrying it around to get members of the delegation to sign it. And theoretically, if you voted for the bill in the delegation vote, you're supposed to sign it. You're supposed to be honor bound to sign it. And so Dorothy went and talked to at least two senators and asked them not to sign it. She asked Hildred Shoemake, who was a Democrat, not to sign it. And she asked Mike Egan not to sign it. And they didn't. And so the bill didn't pass the Senate. Dorothy's story was that the bill had flaws in it, and maybe it did, I don't know. But the real flaw was that it was Sally's bill and not hers. And so it was kind of unbelievable that she would actually then go to people and ask them not to sign the bill. And so I was asked by members of the Sandy Springs Incorporation leadership to run against Dorothy. Eva Galambos asked me to run. And before I did it, I checked out whether this story was actually true, or whether it was just somebody making it up. I called Mike Egan and I asked him, did Dorothy Felton ask you not to sign the bill? And he said yes. So the story was true. Now, later in the campaign, after I got in and was running against Dorothy, Mike changed his tune and said Dorothy didn't ask him to do that. But when I asked him the question, he told me the truth and said that she did.
Did he offer any logic or explanation why? Just
why
she asked and he obliged?
His theory, in private talking to me, was the same thing I just said. It wasn't her bill.
Gotcha.
Right? I mean, it was Sally's bill. And so Mike lied about it during the campaign, and I was sad that happened, but it did.
But eventually, 4 years later, you ran for Kill Townsend's. Oh, I believe Kill retired.
Kill retired in '92.
Okay.
He was succeeded by Mitch Scanalakis, who was elected in '92.
Right.
Mitch was in for one session He was in for the 93 session, and then he ran for Fulton County Commission chairman.
Right.
And he had to resign from the House in order to run for County Commission chairman. So there was a special election in that House district, and I ran and won that in 93.
So this brings us to the 1990s as you were involved during that period. So tell us about the 1990s as your assessment, looking back on it, reflecting back on what the 1990s meant politically, policy-wise for the Republican Party.
So the 1990s were really the decade when we established the two-party system. The two-party system doesn't mean you win every election or even that you're the majority party, but it means that your ideas get taken seriously, that things that you propose have a chance of going into effect. It means that your candidates running in most places have a realistic chance to get elected, and all those things happened in the 1990s. In the 1990 election, we had we elected one congressman, no statewide officials, and 35 House members. So it was the first election in the 90s. By the last election in the 90s, 1998, we had 8 statewide officials, we had 8 congressmen, and we had we elected 76 House members that year. So that the 90s were really the decade that made the difference. We'd been struggling with it for years, and the 90s was the time that it happened. So you might ask yourself, how come? I mean, it was actually a pretty big turnaround from the 80s. I've got some notes here that I'm going to put on my lap. It's actually a pretty big turnaround from the 80s. When we had some big wins in the 80s, Mattingly's race in 1980, Newt was in Congress the whole decade. Pat Swindle was in Congress for 2 terms.
Right.
And we carried the state for Reagan and for Bush in 84 and 88. We had some big losses in the 80s too, and the biggest state disappointment was probably Mattingly getting beaten for re-election, but the 82 and the 86 governor's races were pretty big losses, disappointing. The number of House members sank into the teens in the 80s, and things didn't go very well. The party, as I said, sort of left legislative recruitment and campaign assistance to Operation Breakthrough. The House leadership had pretty much just given up on party building. I mean, they were, if you want to put the kindest face on it and say the way they thought about it, it was, well, we want to serve our districts and we want to affect state policy at the margin, but they've really pretty much given up on building the party. And so you ask what the natural question then is how come it happened in the 90s?
Right.
And I think there were 4 things that came together in the 90s that made that the decade where we actually finally established the two-party system. The first was population growth. The state had been growing by the time the 90s came around at a healthy clip for 3 full decades. And we're used to Georgia growing now, but from the entire period from 1840 to 1960, Georgia grew every decade slower than the country as a whole.
Really?
And it was only in 1960, in the 60s, that the population growth began to happen. And that led to increases in the number of congressional districts that were available.
Right.
But most of those voters that came to Georgia in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s were Republican-leaning voters. And so the state became a lot more favorable in the 90s than it had been before. I just wrote these things down so you realize the scale of it. In 1960, state population was 3.9 million. In 1990, the state population was 6.4 million. And by 2000, the state population was 8.1 million. So this kind of cumulative population growth, again, mostly Republican voters, made it better turf. The second thing that happened was, particularly in '92, reapportionment was really very beneficial for us. First time that reapportionment had ever been kind of halfway managed by the Republicans, because it's done by the legislature. But we were able to leverage an alliance between the Republican caucus and the Black caucus to draw districts that were more favorable to Republicans and more favorable to Black candidates and less favorable to white Democrats. The Democratic term for this was bleaching the districts. That's a loaded term, but what you do is you separate Black voters into districts where they can elect Black candidates, and what you're left with in a lot of areas was an electorate that would elect Republican candidates. So it was a good coalition, and we were able to leverage the Bush Justice Department to approve that and to really sort of push it along. And it was very helpful to Republicans and to Black candidates. Ended up in '92 with a lot more people elected from both of those constituencies. Had some strange-looking districts, which we'll come back to in the '95 reapportionment session. But reapportionment, especially in '92, was a big help. So in 1990, we elected 35 House members. In 1992, we elected 52. And most of that was reapportionment.
And were most of those Metro Atlanta?
Most of them were, yeah. Then the third thing that happened in the 90s was the accelerated movement of the National Democratic Party to the left. You think of Bill Clinton now as kind of a halfway moderate, Democratic president, but in his first 2 years especially, he was a very liberal left-wing president. And we've always done the best in terms of building the party when we had a liberal Democrat in the White House. Better than having a Republican, better than having even Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter was, at least some days he was a conservative. And so having Bill Clinton in the White House was as sort of the foil for Republican candidates. That was a big deal, and that helped in the 90s. And the fourth thing that I think came together in the 90s was the reassembly of the long-range planning committee leadership. I mean, it was Newt and John and Paul and me. In the 70s, we were trying to reshape the party, but in the 90s, all of us really were now in positions of power to do something. And I think the reassembly of that Republican leadership team was the fourth thing that came together. We didn't have Mac, but we found in Rusty Paul, we found a state chairman who was as committed to legislative races and growing the party in the legislature, as committed to it as Mac had been. So I think the leadership team in the 90s was the fourth element that came together and made the 90s successful.
I think a very similar, now that you point that out, a very similar approach in their leadership styles, very much a sort of businessman, consultant sort of style, where Mac had applied what Bill Brock was trying to do in at the RNC at the national level. He tried to bring to the party in the late 70s. I guess party chairman, Republican Party chairman in the early 90s would have been, what's his name?
What, state party chairman?
No, at the RNC.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure who it was.
Who would have been Bush's campaign manager from '88, whose name?
Oh, Lee Atwater.
Lee Atwater, and then Lee passed away, obviously, before '92. I'll have to check on that. All of us, though, were important, I think, in not just in being a team and people that knew each other and could work together easily, but Newt was the Speaker of the House, and so he helped us
raise money.
Right.
He helped us get attention. John was the chairman of the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. And so he had a lot of influence over selection of Republican candidates for Congress. And some of the congressmen were actually very helpful in legislative races. Bob Barr was helpful, Jack Kingston was helpful, John Linder was helpful himself. Some were not. I mean, Saxby Chambliss was not helpful at all. In fact, there was one race, one of the races that we were targeting in '96 was Doug Everett running against Tommy Chambliss. Doug was a city councilman in Albany, and Tommy Chambliss was a very prominent Democrat at the Capitol. He was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And this was one of our top targeted races. And Doug told me the story. He said he asked, Saxby had been in for 2 years and was popular in the district. And so he wanted Saxby to take a picture with him just so he could prove to people that it was actually Tommy Chambliss that he was running against, not Saxby Chambliss, because you know how people get names confused. Sure. And Saxby wouldn't do it. He wouldn't even have his picture taken with him. And so he wasn't very helpful in terms of party building, but some of the congressmen were. And that was partly, I think, through Newt's influence and especially through John's influence. And Paul was helpful in fundraising. He was helpful in statewide contacts as he would build his network.
Oh, right.
He would put him in touch with Republican candidates. And he'd been in the legislature so long that he was a good strategic advisor.
Oh, sure.
And what I did in terms of politics in the caucus was, I brought party building back to sort of the center of the agenda for the House caucus. And Rusty helped direct a lot of resources to legislative campaigns. Good staff, money issues. So it was a good team, and I think the team was part of the success.
So, but before any of that could happen, you got elected, and then you became House Minority Leader. Yeah. Tell me, and I assume the Republican caucus works the same way as the Democratic caucus, and all the Republicans get together and fight amongst themselves to see who's going to be the leader of the party in the House.
Never as much fighting as we had in '94, I don't think.
So tell me about '94. It looks like you were running, succeeding your friend Steve Stansel, who stepped down, against a fellow named Scott Dix, I believe.
Yeah, there were 4 candidates originally.
Okay, 4 originally.
And Steve and Garland Penholster asked me to run.
Okay.
Steve did not want to run again because he wanted to run for Congress in '96, and he thought he'd be better positioned to do that if he was not the minority leader in the House. Been a lot of controversy in Steve's term also. Not Steve's fault, but it was just Sally Newbill, who was, I mentioned before, she was a state senator from this area. Sally Newbill referred to the Republican caucus, compared it to Bosnia, which was not entirely unfair.
A dated reference.
But at the time, very current.
Right.
So there were 4 candidates. I ran, Scott Dix ran. Scott was the head of what was called the Conservative Policy Caucus, which was one of the sub-caucuses we have. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But the third candidate was Bart Ladd from DeKalb County, and the 4th candidate was Robin Williams from Augusta.
Okay.
And so the system is you drop out the low person on each ballot, and the first 2 ballots dropped out Robin and Bart. And so it was Scott and me. And then it was a tie for like 5 or 6 ballots. And what finally broke the tie was that Burke Day, who was a newly elected member from Chatham County, who I think, actually, and Burke became a dear friend, but I think he had actually been voting for Dix. I think that because of his political background. But he asked, we stopped and we said, look, we got to do something to break this tie, right? So let's ask the candidates some questions. And so Burke asked a question. He to both of us. He said, "Can you give us an example of a situation where you've been able to reach across the aisle and work with the Democrats to get something passed?" And of course, I had lots of examples, and Scott didn't have any. And so that's really what broke the tie. And then I won by 10 votes.
So you were able to point back to your first stint in the Georgia House.
Yeah, but even in the 94 session, I had a couple of things I could mention. So that that was the thing that broke the tie.
So you mentioned that he was a member of this policy committee. Was that sort of an analog to like the House Freedom Caucus or something like that?
I'm sure they would say
that might not be a very fair.
No,
I don't
think
know.
it is fair. I'm sure they would have said that. But so when I got back in '93, there were really almost two separate caucuses. And Mel Steele points this out in his paper. He wasn't there though, so he didn't have to live it every day. There were really almost two distinct Republican caucuses, and they were about equal in size, and they were mutually antagonistic, which is what led Sally to characterize the caucus as being like Bosnia. There was what I would call the sort of the accomplish something caucus. This would have been the people that, as we were talking about, the split between John Linder and Johnny Isakson, these would have been the people who would have been on Johnny's side. They were mostly people who had been there a long time, and they were used to being in a small minority, and they had really given up on ever being a majority, and weren't really making any attempt to build a majority. A lot of them were individually good people, and in fact, in a way, this was sort of my crowd. I mean, these were people I had served with in the 70s or had known in Republican Party politics, but they weren't people that they didn't have the perspective that I had about building the party, or I didn't have their perspective. They had no goal of party building. They were the people that a lot of other more doctrinaire Republicans, if you would, called them rhinos, Republicans in name only. And they kind of operated individually, as you would expect. They would, from their perspective, the way they would explain it is they were trying to do something for their district and realized they were a small minority and they could maybe affect state policy at the margins.
Right.
The people who didn't like that approach said they were just go along to get along people. This was Matt Towery, Robin Williams, Kathy Ash, Betty Jo Williams, Dorothy Felton. I mean, they'd been there a long time, and that's the way they got used to operating. So that was about half the caucus. The other half of the caucus was what you might call the resistance caucus. And their belief, they didn't have a strategy to become a majority either. And in fact, what they would always repeat is, we ought to act like we're in the majority, which I kept pointing out to them, we're not in the majority. We need a strategy to become the majority. But they didn't have a strategy. Their strategy was, let's prove to the people of Georgia that we're the real conservatives, and if we can prove that, then it'll happen automatically, and we'll win. And you can see how they were mostly new members, right? And so you could see how the only two elections they'd really had experience with were 92 and 94. 92 we gained 17 seats, and 94 we gained 14 seats. They just thought it was going to keep going as long as they proved to the people of the state that they were conservatives. And they were the ones that had organized themselves as the Conservative Policy Caucus, the CPC, which was, as I said, sort of a sub-caucus, right? I mean, sort of a pressure group within the Republican caucus. But they were about half the caucus, and that's who supported Scott Dix. And so this was, Scott Dix and Mitchell Kay, Dan Lackley, Brian Joyce, Vance Smith. I mean, they were, leaders of that. And some of the things they did were just crazy and juvenile. I mean, I remember the first or second or third day of the 94 session, I was just back, and Mitchell K. was passing around this amendment to the resolution inviting the governor to make the State of the State address. I mean, because technically the House has to invite the governor to come on the House floor.
Same
and make
at
the State of the State
Congress.
speech, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you always ask the governor, what time do you want to come? Well, he wants to come at 11 o'clock, so the resolution says 11 o'clock. Mitchell was passing around an amendment to not invite the governor at 11 o'clock, but instead to invite him at 11:30. Yeah, and it was just, infantile. I mean, this doesn't gain you any benefit at all. And some of these people were not people that you would actually want to be the leaders of your caucus. I mean, Dan Lackley, for example, got into a knife fight the last night of the session with Billy McKinney.
A literal?
Yeah, literally a knife fight in the north lobby of the House with Billy McKinney. That was,
I don't know how I ever missed this.
Equally Billy's fault, I'm sure, but that's not the kind of person you want to be the leader of your caucus.
So you would describe yourself as a conservative,
yeah.
Correct? How would you differentiate your version of conservatism or understanding of conservatism as opposed to this caucus, which, as you said, tried to position Republicans, or at least themselves, as more conservative than anybody else?
Right. Well, I think what I've always believed is that that the way to position yourself to win elections in a conservative state, and Georgia's a conservative state, is to have sensible conservative policies that you promote. I mean, back to the thought about, I went into politics to affect policy. Mm-hmm. And so I was always interested in putting forward conservative policies, not just resisting what the Democrats were trying to do, trying to put forward a positive program. And I mean, I think, you quoted something that Dick Williams said, which was true, that I legislative success mattered to me. I mean, so in that sense, I was like the accomplish something folks. I wanted to get things that we could pass, but I also wanted this to be part of a strategy to elect a majority of Republicans, and neither one of those sub-caucuses actually had any strategy at all. And so I would say that what's the main difference between me and them? It was that I wanted this to be part of a strategy, and we needed to think about it, and the conservative policies needed to be things that made sense, that the state needed, and that would also be good political assets.
So your leadership team, some of these were elected positions. Mike Evans, caucus chair.
Yeah.
Garland Penholster, caucus vice chair.
Yeah.
Earl Earhart,
yes.
Minority whip. Ann Mueller, minority secretary.
Right.
Tell me about those folks and sort of your working relationship with them.
So the most important partners that I had were Mike Evans and Steve Stansel. Steve ended up not running for Congress because Nathan Deal switched parties, and wasn't possible for Steve then to get any traction. So Steve stayed in the House, and Steve and Mike were the most important partners that I had. Garland was active mainly in recruiting and in campaigns. I mean, he did that 24 hours a day, 365.
That old basketball coach.
Yeah, and he had been used to recruiting people for basketball, so he recruited candidates. The vice chairman job, Steve told me, was really created for Garland. And nobody ever challenged Garland for that because he did such a good job in it. And that was really the purpose of it, was to recruit candidates, recruit switchers, help candidates in campaigns. Garland was really responsible for that. Did a great job at it. That was mainly what he did. Earl sat right next to me. Earl was a good partner and confidant. He had some agenda items of his own that he pushed, which maybe we'll come back to that. And Ann was very loyal and very supportive, a good Republican, good member. But again, the principal the most important partners were Mike Evans and Steve Stansel. I will tell you one funny story about Ann. This was one of the times when I knew the two-party system had arrived. This was after the 1996 election, when we had all gone over to Athens to the Institute for Legislators that they do in
the
December,
biennial
thing. And so it was Sunday night or Monday night. I mean, it's like a 3-day thing. Ann and I were going around seeing people in different rooms that night, and there was a hospitality suite hosted by Jim Tudor, who was the lobbyist for the convenience stores, and the most popular lobbyist at the Capitol because he hardly ever asked for anything, and he made his sort of station in the north lobby of the Capitol every day, handing out food. You know, he'd hand out crackers and ice cream and peanuts and everything. So he was very popular, nice guy, and hardly ever asked for anything, which was another reason why he was popular. But he had this hospitality suite, and Ann and I walked into his hospitality suite, and at the moment nobody else was in there. And so he came over and was chatting us up, and then a few minutes later, Tom Murphy swept in with his entourage of Butch and Bill Lee, and I don't remember who was with him, but 3 or 4 people. And so Tudor immediately left us and went over to the other side of the room where Tom and his crew were sitting and was chatting them up. And so I just, he expected that we were going to do that too, right? That Ann and I were going to go over and pay our respects to the speaker. And so I said to Ann, let's just sit here and see what happens. And sure enough, after about 3 or 4 minutes, Jim Tudor realized that we had not come over to chat up the speaker. And so he moved his chair back into the exact center of the room, moved away from Murphy toward us, back to the exact center of the room so that he could not be accused of playing favorites. That was one of the moments when I knew the two-party system had arrived.
that you finally had to take what these Republican folks over in the corner.
Yeah, you couldn't diss them.
You had to take them seriously.
You couldn't diss them.
So this is, you've got your leadership team. How are you going to run the caucus different than, say, a Steve Stansel had, or a Paul Hurd, or a Johnny Isakson?
Yeah. So when I ran for minority leader in '94, I sent a letter out to everybody in the caucus that said that I thought there were 4 goals that I'd like for us to pursue. The first one was to be the best source of new policy ideas at the Capitol. Have the Republican caucus be the best source. This wasn't real hard because the Democrats didn't have hardly any ideas. I mean, the governor had ideas, Zell Miller, but the Democrats in the House and Senate, pretty much didn't ever have a program. And but I thought this was important. That was sort of the foundation, was for us to become the best source of policy ideas at the Capitol. The second thing was for us to actually have a substantive impact on the state government. And this is the issue about, do you just resist and make a point of how conservative you are, or you're actually trying to accomplish something. I always thought we actually ought to try to accomplish something, and so that was my second goal. The third goal was to break the one-party system forever. That was the way we always talked about it for years, was breaking the one-party system. And the fourth goal was that I wanted us to do all of this without becoming like the Democrats, without becoming obsessed with lobbyists and there used to be, in the old days, there's a lot of drinking on the last night of the session, and you're not supposed to have liquor in the Capitol, but somehow in the minority leader's office there was always some liquor, and in a bunch of other offices there was always liquor. I never did that, so I wanted us to not be like the Democrats. So I would say in the 1990s we accomplished the first 3 and didn't do as well on the fourth as I would have liked.
Interesting. So,
but you ask how we did,
yeah.
and so I think there are 5 things that I would talk about, and I sort of think of them as acts in a play, if you will. But I mean they're overlapping. They are logically sequential, but in terms of time, they're overlapping because you have to do them over and over again. So the first thing we did was every year at the beginning of the session, we'd have a joint House-Senate press conference to lay out the Republican program for the session. Nobody had ever done that before. I'm not sure how the Senate was a smaller group because the Senate's a smaller body,
right.
And so it was more informal. We actually had a Republican caucus retreat in like November or December of every year to agree on a list of things that we would put forward as our program. So we had a press conference at the beginning of every year to lay out the Republican program. We sort of learned as we went along on this. I mean, we'd have 3 or 4 or 5 high-profile items, but another couple of dozen items that weren't so high-profile. And one of the things we learned was that while the Democrats would stoutly resist the 3 or 4 or 5 top priorities that we would have, we had a lot more success in passing the others. I counted up in '98. We actually had 24 priorities, and we did pretty well on the bottom half. We didn't do as well on the top half because they were, seen as partisan issues and things we were trying to do to give ourselves a leg up. But we did pretty well on the bottom half of the issues, which were not unimportant things. These were things having to do with cracking down on DUI offenders, reform of the involuntary separation process, where if you could arrange to get yourself fired at the right time, you could make more money in retirement than you made when you were working for the state. These were, important items. So we were a lot more successful with the bottom half than we were the first. But things that we proposed, welfare reform. Mm-hmm. We proposed tax cuts. We proposed the bill requiring you to serve at least 85% of your sentence if you were a violent offender. We proposed voter ID, taxpayers' bill of rights, toll lanes that became the Peach Pass lanes, decentralizing state government. So, I mean, a bunch of things. Privatizing Grady Hospital was one of them. Some of these things we were able to pass. Some of them we were able to get implemented another way. Somebody would, a Democrat in one way or another would steal it and do it, but you still get it done. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing we did, is we tried to become known as the source of ideas by putting out some ideas. And these were conservative policy issues that we genuinely believed ought to be the policy of the state, and that we also hoped would give us some advantage in elections.
So this is, you have Zell Miller and then later Governor Barnes basically putting out the Democratic program in the State of the State speech.
Yeah, it was the governor's program. It wasn't really the Democratic program.
So, I guess the analog would be sort of the shadow government over here is being emanated from the legislature, not necessarily the Republican Party in the state.
I mean, we were clearly in the best position to do that, much better position than the party.
Right.
The party was supportive. Rusty was supportive of doing this, but it was a joint press conference with the Senate leadership also, and we got good attendance.
The loyal opposition.
Yeah. So the second thing that we did then was to try to set up what you might call test votes. Because another thing we had discovered along the way, that I discovered along the way, was that it was hard to hold Democratic members accountable just as Democrats. That is, it was hard to say, well, the Republicans, voted this way on this bill and the Democrats voted the other way. First of all, it usually didn't fall completely along party lines like that. But even when it did, I found that it was hard to hold an individual Democratic member accountable for a vote unless that member had voted that way. if you could actually get people on votes they had cast, then you had something to work on. If you just had to say, well, the Democrats did that, it didn't work.
I see.
Right? Because they could all say, well, that wasn't me, that was somebody else. And so we tried to set up test votes that politically, again, we never proposed anything that we thought was not good public policy, that was something the state ought to do. Within that, you try to find things that would be politically helpful. And so one of the things that we tried to get done was the 85% sentence bill. This 85% sentence bill. This was actually Mike Bauer's idea, that people who committed serious violent felonies should have to serve at least 85% of their sentence. They were getting let out at a third or a half of the sentence on probation and committing other crimes. And this was the federal standard, 85%. Mike got us to adopt it, and that turned out to be a very important test vote. We couldn't actually get a substantive vote ever on the bill itself, but we got a vote on a motion to get it out of committee. And we used that vote in the 96 election, and that was the most important reason why we gained 10 seats in 96.
Let me interrupt you and ask, because the speaker is so incredibly powerful in the Georgia House.
Yeah.
How are you able to compel Democrats or the Democratic legislators to take those difficult votes? How are you able to outmaneuver the speaker from saying killing something in committee,
right,
or refusing to call things to the floor?
Well, it was real hard. I won't lie to you. The speaker is very powerful and played that to the hilt. And Tom Murphy would not hesitate to lie to you to your face and to make up, excuses for why, he ruled the way he did on this bill or that bill. He wouldn't hesitate to do that at all. And so it's very difficult to overcome that. The basic legislative mechanism was amendments. And so we would try to amend bills, and the game that they would play on amendments is that the rule on the House is that if you have a bunch of amendments, the last one in gets voted on first. And if that one passes, then according to Murphy, though I don't interpret the rules this way, according to Murphy, any other amendment to that section of the bill would be out of order. I don't see how he read the rules that way, but that was his interpretation, and you could never get a vote to overturn a rule.
Because the speaker is the parliamentarian.
Well, people are too afraid of it, right? You would never do that. So, so he would always be in control of what was the quote-unquote last amendment in, and the last amendment in was always one that came from, whichever of his lieutenants was handling it, whether it was Larry Walker or Jimmy Skipper or Calvin Spirey or whoever. So he could, while we could have debate about our amendments, it was very difficult to get votes on our amendments. I remember him telling me about the Sandy Springs bill. We had the Sandy Springs Incorporation bill on the floor. It was the only time until the Republicans took over that it ever got on the floor. And he said, well, the reason why I can't be for this bill is because there's a provision in the law that provides state funding to cities. And my little town just depends on that law. And if Sandy Springs becomes a city, that'll dilute that pot, and my little town won't get enough, won't get the money. And so I was stunned at the argument, but I went back to my seat and did a little figuring, and then went back up to him and talked to him again and said, Tom, I figured out that it'll cost your town $500. Here, I'll write a check myself right now to the city of Bremen for $500 if you'll let this bill come up.
And he took that check,
yeah,
and Sandy,
no, he came up with another excuse. But the basic mechanism was amendments. Some of those we got votes on. Another mechanism was rules, a rule to get the bill out of the committee, what would be called a discharge petition in the U.S. House. We did some of those, got votes on that. There there were also one mechanism that I have to give Mitchell K. credit for this. This is one good thing he did do. He led a filibuster, in effect, that led to getting the partial birth abortion ban out of committee. Jim Martin, who was the chairman of the committee, was sitting on the bill, wouldn't let the committee vote on it even. And so we got a vote on the floor on a motion to discharge that from the committee. So you could get floor votes. It wasn't falling off a log easy. And it wasn't so much hard votes that the Democrats were afraid of. It was a voting record. It was hard votes that got recorded, right? Because if they didn't get recorded, you could never do anything with them. What we were trying to do with the votes that we were proposing, in addition to passing good policy, was proposing things that would, in effect, trap conservative Democrats between their constituents and the House leadership. The House leadership would try to get them to oppose things that their constituents were for and that we were for, and in some cases that they were for. So that's the kind of thing that we tried to propose. Mm-hmm. So that's the second thing we did, was set up test votes, and that would give you a voting record that you could use in campaigns. The third thing that we did was to stop things that they wanted. There were things that where we couldn't prevail, but we could stop them from prevailing. And so kind of the outstanding example of that is the reapportionment session in '95. Mm-hmm. The court had ruled the reapportionment plan that had been passed in '92 for Congress. The court had ruled that unconstitutional because it was, somehow in violation of the Voting Rights Act. I don't remember the exact legal justification, but that was the substance of it. And so that ruling came down in maybe June of '95, and we had to have a special session to redraw the congressional districts. Tom Murphy and his cronies took that as the opportunity to also say we're going to redraw the legislative districts. The court had not ruled on the legislative districts. There had been no suit about the legislative districts, so we weren't required to do that. Mm-hmm. But the legislative districts, as drawn in '92, had worked in favor of the Republicans and the Black Caucus, and so he wanted to undo them. So he took this as the opportunity to redraw the legislative districts as well. And it was a very hard-fought fight. Tom Murphy's way of saying what he wanted to do is he said, we're going to reintegrate Georgia, by which he meant we're going to take black constituents from black districts and put them together with white constituents from Republican districts, and we're going to create Democratic districts, because that's the way it used to work. And so we started out with the coalition that we'd been able in previous reapportionments to form between Republicans and blacks. Wasn't perfect, but we were able to do enough to make sure that they did not do any serious damage to any incumbent Republicans or black members. We had enough votes to make sure that happened. They did change some districts, and it probably cost us, I don't know, half a dozen seats in the '96 election. These were Democratic seats that we would have targeted in '96 and didn't get the chance to target because they changed them. But we were able to stop them from undoing any Republican districts. We didn't lose a single member. And then we moved on to congressional district, because that was actually what the court had ordered. And he had the same objective, take black constituents from black districts, of which by then there were 3, and put them together with whites from Republicans and create Democratic districts. And so together with the Black Caucus, we were able to fight them to a standstill. I remember we had, one of the key things was to have an alternative plan, which we never actually got to the floor and never had a vote on, but was a good talking point, especially with the Black Caucus. And it was what we called the consensus plan. It was drawn to protect all the incumbents, and it was endorsed by Newt as the senior Republican from Georgia, and by John Lewis as the senior Democrat from Georgia. So even though we never got a vote on it, it was always in the discussion, and it helped a lot in our being able to have that coalition, and we were able to fight them to a standstill on it, and stopped them from actually passing a congressional reapportionment bill at all, which threw it back into the courts.
Special master.
The courts drew a map that addressed the issues, but did not gerrymander out any incumbent. I mean, my objective at the beginning was to make sure everybody was safe, all the House members and all the congressmen. We had 8 congressmen that we just elected in '94. And I remember Lynn Westmoreland said to me as we were getting started, he said, "Well, you don't expect to save all 8, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And we were able to do it, not by drawing a map that passed, but by stopping them from drawing a map, and that threw it into the courts. The key to it was an imperfect coalition between the Republicans and the Black Caucus to make this happen. Last time we were ever able to do that, but it worked. I do remember, this is another funny story. Billy McKinney,
of knife fighting fame,
went to the well one time during the reapportionment session, and he was making the point that put together there are enough Republicans and black members to stop anything, right? Which is what we were trying to do, and we're ultimately able to do. But he went to the well and he said, "I can add. There's 66 Republicans and there's 32 members of the Black Caucus. 66 plus 32, that's 88." 88 would not have been enough.
No,
it was actually 98. 98 was enough, but it was just funny. He said, "I can add 66 and 32, that's 88. So that's probably the best example of something we were able to stop that they really wanted. But that was very encouraging to Republicans, right? I mean, because we were used to getting sliced up at reapportionment, and so there were other things that were sort of like that. They were trying to play. For 4 or 5 years they tried to play games with the PSC elections. We had won a majority of the PSC in '94, and then all of a sudden the Democrats had a bill to elect the PSC by districts. So surely there would be 2 or 3 Democratic districts, and then we stopped that, and then they wanted to create residency districts, which they ultimately did, so that you still run statewide, but you have to live in the district.
Right.
But the districts they wanted to pass would have cut out 2 of our members that we had elected, so we were able to stop that. So that's another example, and there were a bunch of other things like that we were able to stop that they wanted, and that was very encouraging to Republicans. And then the kind of the fourth act was that we were actually able to accomplish some of the things that we set out to accomplish. Not always by passing our bills. Sometimes there were their bills that we glommed onto and passed. Sometimes it was things that were done by administrative action. So, for example, the 85% sentence bill, we never were able to pass that, but it created pressure because it was a popular issue, and darned if Governor Miller didn't then establish that by administrative action. He directed the Board of Pardons and Paroles to not let anybody out until they'd served 85% of their sentences. So we were able to accomplish it that way. And what that meant was then that every year after that, at the beginning of the session, I would go over, I would see the chairman of the Board of Pardons and Paroles, and I'd say, "This is your policy and you're sticking to it this year, right?" And they'd say, "Right." That was it. So we were able to get that accomplished, even though we couldn't pass the bill.
Do you think Governor Miller did that to take an issue away from the Republicans?
Absolutely, because we had won 10 seats in '96, 10 new seats, pretty much on that issue. Not exclusively, but pretty much. That was the most important, and so he did that administratively. We were able to pass voter ID. It wasn't our bill that got passed. It was Sonny Dixon's bill. He was a Democrat from Savannah, and we glommed onto it and supported it. Murphy wouldn't have passed it, but we provided the votes to pass it, and so we got that accomplished. We were able to get them to propose and pass tax cuts every single legislature in the 90s. And it was because of the pressure we were creating to do it. But it eventually added up to like a $900 million tax cut.
What kind of tax? Income and property?
Income, property, sales. I mean, the first time was 95. And Governor Miller had actually said at one point that he wanted to eliminate the sales tax on food.
Right.
And so we tried to get that done in an amendment to the state budget in the 95 session. Amendment didn't pass, but after the amendment didn't pass, then our House leadership and the Senate leadership held a joint press conference and said, we're going to continue to try to do this in the Senate. Well, that kind of put pressure on the governor and the Senate leadership to come across to the governor's promise to do this. And so the Senate then had to pass a tax cut. And that then put pressure back on the House. Well, how come the Senate's passing a tax cut and the House isn't passing a tax cut? And so they didn't want to pass that one, but they passed a property tax refund. And we were glad with that too. I mean, our position was always states taking in too much money. If you want to cut property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, all those are good. Now, our preference was an income tax cut because that has the most economic stimulus. But, we'd take any kind of tax cut. And so the House then had to pass that, and then the governor vetoed it, and the governor came back then in the 96 session, and sure enough, proposed taking the sales tax off food, and so that got done. And then welfare, then some of them we were able to pass. Welfare reform is probably the outstanding example of that. We've been working on that for a number of years. In fact, in some ways, way back into the 70s. We've been working on welfare reform. But Governor Miller took an interest in this also, and he gave my wife Lynn and me access to the DFACS people in Bibb County. And so Lynn went down and interviewed every single unwed mother that was on welfare in Bibb County. And we developed a real database of the way people respond to incentives, because our thesis was that that the incentives of the welfare system were wrong, that they encouraged people to do things that were not making them productive citizens because that was what you got paid for. And so we used that database, which I think is probably still the biggest database of anywhere in the country about actually interviewing welfare recipients and seeing how they respond to incentives. I mean, most newspaper articles that you see will have one or two people that they referred to. This was like more than 100. We did take guidance on policies from, especially from Wisconsin. Tommy Thompson, when he was the governor of Wisconsin, had passed welfare reform. And so we took policy advice from what they had done. And the governor was interested in it, and so we had a welfare reform bill that we couldn't get out of committee, naturally. But the governor had a bill that was similar, not identical, that got past the Senate and got over to the House. And the combination of the governor and the Republicans created enough pressure that the Democrats had to report out something. But this is an example of how the lengths they would go to try to maintain control of the debate. So they wouldn't pass the governor's bill. They had the committee, which was Health Affairs, I think. Georgiana Sinkfield was the chairman of the committee. And so they had the committee write a completely different bill, which would have actually made the welfare system worse than it was, already. And so that's what passed the committee. But then they took some soundings in the House and realized that couldn't pass the House. And so overnight they wrote yet another bill and put in a floor substitute. Meanwhile, we were trying to keep track of what was going on, and we were getting the Legislative Counsel's office to write amendments to every conceivable version of the welfare bill because we didn't know what would actually hit the floor. And the last night of the session, that last afternoon, Murphy called me up to the rostrum and handed me this envelope and said, "Well, here's our welfare bill." And I said, you got to give us time to get the amendments conform to the bill. So he did that, and so we rushed to do that. And after a couple of hours, we had the debate on the floor about the welfare bill, and it was in a way the most remarkable thing of my whole tenure. What we proposed was to substitute the governor's bill that had passed the Senate for the bill that was the House leadership's floor substitute. And it was about a 2 or 3 hour debate on it. And what was so remarkable is that at the end of the debate, Murphy came down to the floor and spoke for their bill and against our substitute. And that was unusual, but not unprecedented. I mean, he would come to the well, from time to time on issues he really cared about. What was remarkable is that after he spoke on their amendment or their bill and against our substitute, he stayed on the floor and managed the bill. I mean, he took over Jimmy Skipper's desk and microphone, and he made all the motions and made all the proposed the amendments, and on our side I made the motions and proposed all of our amendments. And I had never seen him do that before. Nobody had ever seen him do that before or after, that he would actually stay on the floor and manage the bill. But it was because, truthfully, nobody really understood what was going on except him and me. And so we won, and I remember running up, we had put a number of other amendments on the bill to strengthen it. And I remember going over to Thurber Baker, who was the governor's floor leader, and said, it's going back over the Senate. I said to him, look, you can take off any of our amendments if you need to pass the bill. But it got back over to the Senate, and they decided they didn't want it to come back to the House at all, so they left all our amendments on. And we passed welfare reform on the floor of the House.
Do you remember what the vote was?
It was fairly close. I want to say maybe it was, 98 to, whatever.
About 7-vote margin, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't many. It was, I made the point afterwards to the caucus that I think I had said we won 10 seats in 96. We didn't. We won an additional 8 seats in 96. And I made the point to the caucus afterwards that those 8 seats were the difference, that we won by 8 votes or less on welfare reform. And that generated a lot of angst in the Democratic caucus. And we had 4 members who switched parties because of that, because they just couldn't defend voting against welfare reform back in their districts, and they had voted for the bill, but then they couldn't defend hanging on as members of the Democratic caucus that was trying to get them to do this. And so we had 4 members that switched parties, and we won one special election because Sonny Dixon had resigned and Ron Stevens won that election down in Chatham County. And we came close in a second election, and this is one that would have really rocked the foundations of the Capitol if we had won it. The guy who represented Moultrie, Hanson Carter, Democrat, voted for our welfare bill. Resigned to take a job with the U.S. Agriculture Department, and so we had a special election down there, which we lost by 200 votes. Again. Saxby. I mean, our candidate was a guy who had actually been in Saxby Chambliss's law office in his firm, and he wouldn't endorse him. I mean, I'm sure he voted for him, but he wouldn't endorse him. And so we lost by 200 votes or 300 votes or something. But that one, because that was deep South Georgia, that would have really rocked the foundations of the Capitol had we won that. So anyway, I mean, long story, but welfare reform is probably the best example of something that we were actually able to get passed. We also got charter schools passed. We got the ban on partial birth abortion passed. We got access to the Hope Scholarship for homeschoolers passed. We were able to get all those things done. And this again is evidence, I think, of the real two-party system having arrived. And a couple other things that we were able to get passed another way. I mean, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights that Governor Barnes made one of his signature initiatives, that was actually ours. I mean, you know, talk about Democrats really stealing things. He really did. But of course we were for it, so we all voted for it.
I think the term in the 90s was triangulation.
Yeah, there you go. The central part of that was to reverse the burden of proof on your appeal for your property tax assessment, because the burden of proof had always been with the taxpayer. You had to prove that what the county said your property was worth was wrong. And we thought it ought to be the other way around. The county ought to have to prove that it's right if you appeal it. So we were able to get that done, and other little things that really do make a difference. Like one of the provisions that we got in that bill was that the county had to let you know of all the exemptions that you might be eligible for. They would never let you know, right? I mean, so how would you know if you were eligible for this one of a dozen potential exemptions? They had to let you know what the list of exemptions was, so you could see if you were eligible. Small things like that, but important. So that's the fourth thing that we were able to do, which is to accomplish things that we want. And then the fifth thing that we did was to recruit and more and better candidates, recruit switchers, and give people campaign assistance and give people talking points. And this was really the intersection with the state party. I mean, we worked closely with Rusty and the state party on this. And we got some people as candidates who would probably in the past have run as Democrats just because that was their local area. But I mean, you know, Doug Everett was one of those. Austin Scott was one of those. Bill Heath, who eventually ran against and beat Tom Murphy, was one of those guys that we were able to recruit. Bill Hamrick, who eventually became a state senator, he lost his House race, but we were able to recruit him. He was the nephew, I think, of the head of the GBI. So, I mean, he would have been a Democrat if he had run, in the 80s. Whatever you think of his subsequent record as Speaker of the House, Glenn Richardson was somebody that we were able to recruit and get elected. He would have probably run as a Democrat in the 80s. Dan Ponder from deep southwest Georgia. And somebody we were talking about earlier, Renee Unterman. I mean, Renee probably would have run as a Democrat in the 80s. But we were able to recruit these people because we were having success and because the party was organizing to help them in the campaigns. And two very high-profile switchers. One that Newton, the congressman, brought over, Nathan Deal.
Right.
And one that the senators brought over, Sonny Perdue. And all this was because we were having success.
There was a story you told me one time about your first speaker's election as you were minority leader. Would have been 95, I suppose, about an effort to put together an anti-Murphy coalition.
Yeah.
Go ahead and tell me about your efforts, what you hope to accomplish, and how, obviously, based on our discussion here, it didn't come to pass.
Right. Well, like Billy McKinney, I could add. And I could figure that if we could get 30 or 25 or 30 Democrats to join a coalition with us, we could actually elect somebody other than Tom Murphy. And there were only two people that had ever run against Tom Murphy in the Democratic caucus. One was Al Burris in 1976. And then the second was Dubose Porter in 1992, which was the year before I got back. And so both of them lost. Both of them lost essentially for the same reason, which is that they both thought the Black Caucus would be in play, and it turned out not to be. Black Caucus sided with Murphy both times. And so he won big because, if any individual member can see that Murphy's going to win, well, they're going to, abandon the challenger in a heartbeat. So you have to believe that you're going to win. So, I could add, and, it seemed to me that there was an opportunity to replace Tom Murphy. And the the Democrats that we tried to appeal to were the people who voted for DuBose Porter. Now, that was a secret, because it was a secret ballot. So Jeanette Jameson, who had been one of them, gave me a handwritten list that she and DuBose had drawn up of people they believed had voted for DuBose. And it was around about 25 people. And so those were the people that we were appealing to. But the other side of it was that we had to get the Republicans to agree to go along with it, and not everybody wanted to do that. I mean, there were Republicans. There was Dan Lackley, who was a Republican from Fayette County, had announced his candidacy for Speaker. An obviously crazy thing to do, but he had done it, and a lot of the CPC people were backing Dan Lackley. And so they were opposed to making a deal with the Democrats that would elect a Democratic Speaker, because whoever we would elect would obviously be a Democrat of some kind. And so they were against that. There were people who really, were happy with Tom Murphy being the Speaker. They were, either one of those groups was happy to have a symbolic Republican race for Speaker, where we were obviously going to lose. They were happy to have a symbolic race, but they didn't want a real race. They didn't want something that really had a chance of succeeding. There were people who were really perfectly happy with Murphy being the Speaker. Matt Towery, Kathy Ash, several others.
The Accomplish Something.
The Accomplish Something
group.
Caucus, right. I mean, they had lived with Murphy, and they were really, they were perfectly happy with Murphy being Speaker. So they were against this kind of a coalition too. As it turned out, we weren't able to get any traction with the Democrats. They were when DuBose ran in '92, he had counted. I mean, I wasn't there, but this is the story Steve Stansel told me, that DuBose had counted on Republicans being for him, and they had the same kind of split in '92, and the Republicans couldn't deliver. And so when you go then and talk to the Democrats who voted for DuBose, they didn't believe the Republicans would deliver this time either. Turned out they were right, but they didn't believe it, and so we couldn't get any traction with them. We tried to have a meeting in Athens at the biennial conference that year, and only Ken Poston showed up. And so, we knew if only Ken Poston showed up that it wasn't going to work. And so I got pushback from both of those groups and the Republicans, and it couldn't happen. It was a bridge too far. I tried to get, Paul was actually very helpful in this. We had I remember a Sunday morning phone call where I was trying to get Paul and Newt and John to explain this to some of the members in the caucus. And Paul was very helpful, trying to figure out how to maneuver this around. And Newt understood, and Newt, I think, really wanted to help. I remember him telling me that Mary Ann had said to him, Mary Ann, his wife then, had said to him, Tom Murphy's, if you could beat Tom Murphy, you can cut off the head of the snake, right? Because Murphy had, tried to gerrymander Newt out of the House more than once. And so, but John was not for it. John thought that, you would have thought John might have been for it. John thought that Newt should not expend any of his newfound political capital in trying to get Tom Murphy beat. So I never could get them involved, and it just it didn't work. It was a bridge too far.
Well, it's like you said, John Linder was always more of the confrontation than the sort of go along, get along. So he figured you should probably spend your time electing Republicans instead
No,
of
what he thought was Newt ought to spend all his time in Congress, and that he ought not to use up any political capital back in Georgia. And John had started focusing on Washington. Sure. And I think Newt really kind of wanted to do it, but John talked him out of it. And
interesting.
Paul wanted to do it too, but it wasn't as easy for Paul to make it happen. I remember Paul. I said Paul helped as he was building his network. He would help us build, a network to elect Republican legislative candidates. I remember he told me this story that, remember David Gambrell?
Mm-hmm.
David became a Republican eventually. I was at this Phil Graham rally, Phil Graham for president, and there was a good crowd, 300 or 400 people, I think, in a big room. And there was this guy behind me that was just yelling and carrying on and clapping louder than you could imagine. And I turned around and it was David. But his wife, Luck, was from Emmanuel County, from Swainsboro. And Paul told me the story of calling David up after Paul had gotten elected U.S. Senator and said, David, I need you to help me build my connections in Emmanuel County. Can you do that? David said, sure, I'd be happy to. Who are the people you know down there? And Paul said to him, that's just it. I don't know anybody. Even though he had carried Emmanuel County against Watch Fowler, he didn't know anybody.
Well, now he knows one.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, I tried to get them involved, but they wouldn't do it.
Now, I assume you never attempted any similar cross-party alliance. The rest of the
No, I mean, it was. I thought it would be worth it if we could beat Murphy, but the opportunity to collect Democratic votes to beat Murphy didn't appear again. Mm-hmm. So no, we didn't try it again. Plus, I mean, in all honesty, I got burned on it. It was very controversial inside the Republican caucus, and I just didn't want to do it again.
So you've taken us up to about 1998. Did you anticipate major gains in 1998? This is the second midterm election, President Clinton's election. Traditionally, there is some windfall for the out party.
Yeah.
What were the results of the 98 election? What had you been hoping for, and what actually materialized?
Well, so I actually did think that it was a possibility for us to win a majority in 98. We had won 52 seats in 92, 66 in 94, 74 in 96, plus we picked up 5 that year, 4 switchers and 1 special election. So we were at 79 seats going into the 98 election. We had never actually elected 79.
Right.
But we had 79 seats. And so, yes, I really did think that we had a chance to win a majority. And I was eager to prove to, especially to the business community, that we could be trusted to run the government because they'd never had any experience dealing with
right.
us. And so I probably actually allowed myself to appear a little overconfident. What I did to reassure him was I told him who I was going to appoint as the chairman of the key committees, who I was going to appoint as the chairman of the Rules Committee, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And I was trying to do this to reassure him that these were respectable people. I was going to appoint Ronnie Culbreth to be the head of the Ways and Means Committee. I was going to appoint Steve Stansel to be the head of the Appropriations Committee. I was going to appoint Mike Evans to be the chairman of the Rules Committee. I thought this would reassure people, and I think it probably did, but I think it also, Bill Shipp was able to play it as me being overconfident that we were going to win. And so I regret that I did that. That's the reason why I did it. But I really did think we had a chance to win. We won all the close elections in 96, and we lost all the close elections in 98. And it was partly it was the way the year turned out. I mean, it was a Democratic year nationwide. I mean, the Republicans lost seats in the House, and that was part of it. We also had a candidate for lieutenant governor, Mitt Skanalakis, who was a drag on the ticket more than anything else because he had really energized black voters. I mean, he was, one of his TV ads said, I'm going to kick Atlanta's butt or something like that. and not only not tasteful, but actually calculated unintentionally on his part to bring out black voters. And so we had a big black turnout. The national tide was against us, and we lost all the close races in '98. We elected more than we had ever elected.
Right.
We elected 78, but that was a net loss of 1.
Right, with the expectations being so high that. But I think if I went back and looked at the numbers, and maybe Chuck Bullock would know this. He would know this for sure. The Republican candidates statewide for legislature, there were more Republican voters than there were Democratic voters in '96 and '98.
Yes,
I believe.
In the House races, we won a majority of votes from '96 on.
Right.
Every year. And the Senate won a majority of votes from '98 on. And so it was only gerrymandering that kept the Democrats in power. Now, Larry Walker said in response to that, it's like talking about a baseball game, saying, well, we got more hits, but we didn't win the game. And, the way the game is played, of course, is seats. So,
right.
So, we didn't win, but we did win a majority of votes from then on. So what sort of happened at the end of the decade then is that we plateaued, right? I mean, we were no longer getting big gains, and our critical leadership team collapsed. I mean, Newt was ousted as the House Speaker at the end of '98, and that took John with him because John's influence had been as the chairman of the RNCCC, and that's appointed by the House Speaker. And John was aggressive with the members, and so when Newt went down, John went down too. Rusty's term ended in 1999. Paul died in 2000. And I was voted out in 2000. Partly, I think, because we plateaued, partly because I had put more emphasis than members wanted me to put on not being like Democrats. And so we never, our team never managed another session or fought another election together. What people have said, and I think this is right, we got to be Joshua, we got to be Moses, getting the Republicans out of the house of bondage into the real two-party system, but we never got to be Joshua, never got to get the party into the promised land.
So looking at it now from a distance, how has Republican governance in the legislature in the 2000s, how has it changed from what you saw and experienced in the 70s and in the 90s?
Well, a lot of people have made the point that there are a lot of similarities between Republican governance now and Democrats in the old days. What are the old days? Maybe the Busbee era or the Joe Frank Harris era. And I think there are similarities. I mean, I think the thing that's most striking is that the Democrats in those days were really a pro-business party. And you tried to do things to make Georgia a good place to do business because that was good for everybody. And that's the way they were then, and that's the way the Republicans are now. I mean, I think that's probably the most obvious thing. There's also a point in terms of membership. I mean, I've heard Larry Walker make this point. Larry was elected the first time in '72, just like I was. He said, when I got there, it was the white rural men who ran the House, and now again, it's the white rural men who run the House. And they're Republicans now, not Democrats. And the junior partner is suburban voters, whereas when the Democrats were in charge, the junior partner was the Black Caucus.
Right.
So there's a difference. But I think on the surface, you see a lot of the committee chairmen would have been Democrats in the 70s and 80s. Some of them were Democrats, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think the Democrats were always interested in keeping taxes down, not so much cutting taxes. I think they believed it was important to keep taxes down to attract business and make business happy, but they never really, they believed in they believed in spending everything they took in. And they never really believed that that Georgia was overtaxed. I always believed that, not just my opinion. Kiplinger said that several times, and I think the Republicans think that now. So the Republicans are trying to cut taxes more than the Democrats were. They really were only interested in it in the 90s when we sort of maneuvered them into a position over and over again to feel like they had to do it. The Democrats were interested in a balanced budget, and I think the Republicans are more interested in actually holding down the growth of the budget. I mean, that's a step beyond just having a balanced budget. There were years in the 90s when the budget grew $1 billion a year, and they were content to spend it all. Just thought it was, the byproduct of growth in the state, which it was. But I think one of the ideas that we put on the table that we never could get past was putting a cap on how much of the state's income could be taken up by taxes. And I think Republicans are interested in holding down the growth of the budget. The budget now, this year, is not a whole lot bigger than it was Roy Barnes's last budget. I think it's more or less $25 billion now, and Roy Barnes's last budget would have been 20 years ago, and it was like $21 billion then. So that's not actually, that's actually a pretty good accomplishment, holding down growth for a 20-year period. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats have been much interested in ethics legislation. That was part of my point about not being like the Democrats. I think, there's a natural tendency on the party of the ends to act like ends, and I think that's a long-term mistake and a short-term, failing. And so I think that's not much different. I wish it were different. I think there is more emphasis now, and this I think is part of having the Republicans in charge. It's also part of the times. I think there's more emphasis on legislation about abortion and more emphasis on legislation about guns. You never saw too much of that when the Democrats were in charge. I think that's partly parties, but I think it's also partly the times. And so I think there's a lot of similarities. There's some differences, but it's not a night and day difference. David Schaefer made this point. I think when he got elected state chairman a couple of months ago. I saw this in the paper, that the Democratic Party that we replaced was a centrist party that had members who were genuine conservatives and members who were genuine liberals, but was generally a pro-business party and didn't want to create radical change in the state, wanted progress. That's the Democratic Party we replaced. The Democratic Party that wants to replace us is very different from that. It swung way over to the left, and you'd see a dramatic difference, I think, in what comes out of the state government if the new Democratic Party were to take over.
Were you surprised at how close Stacey Abrams came to being elected
Yeah,
last November?
I was. And I haven't done the analysis myself. I've heard different theories about why. The interview that you did with Roy Barnes and me, Roy basically said it was because of a high black turnout. And I've heard that theory other places. But then I just recently watched a video that you did of somebody who's a professor at UGA who said that the black turnout was not that much higher than it had been in
Trey Hoods.
Yeah, Trey.
He runs the polling outfit.
It was not that much higher than it had been in 2014. So I'm not really sure exactly how to account for it statistically. Yes, I was surprised. I hope it's a wake-up call for Republicans. I think some of the legislative seats that Republicans lost. I don't have much personal knowledge of this, but I've heard people who do say that some of the incumbents took it for granted and didn't work hard enough. I mean, I imagine that's true. That's certainly how we picked up some seats in the 90s, was the Democratic incumbent didn't work hard enough. I mean, there was a guy over in Winder who was not a bad guy, actually voted with us some of the time, but we had a good candidate, and the Democrat went to France for a month in the second half of September and the first half of October. And by the time he got back, Warren Massey had stolen a march on him. And so, would we have won that seat without that? I bet we wouldn't have. If he had worked, I think it was okay. So, I hope this is a wake-up call for Republicans. I mean, the state representative here is Deborah Silcox, and she represents Sandy Springs, and she said that she noticed early in going door to door this year that a lot of people would say, well, I can't vote for you because I don't like the things the Republicans are doing in Washington. And she said, I would say to them, do you realize what I'm doing at the State House? I'm trying to reduce your taxes, I'm trying to do these other things. And they would all say, I'll vote for you, I didn't know that. I bet there are a lot of Republican incumbents who actually didn't do that. They may not have gone door to door in the first place, and didn't make the case.
I was, if we're looking at it in the 1990s, and the first thing you mentioned was demographic change, population growth. Is the shoe on the other foot now in that population growth, demographic change is benefiting the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent it is. I think a lot of the new population growth in the state in the last 10 years is people who demographically favor the Democrats or have historically favored the Democrats. I'm not one of those people that believes demographics is destiny. I think it's a factor, but I really think the Democrats kind of assume this, that the demographics will simply carry them to victory. That once there are enough black voters and enough Hispanic voters that they'll win, because those groups have historically voted majority Democratic. And I don't accept that. I mean, I think that's an issue to be dealt with. But I think the fundamental assumption there is the Republicans aren't going to do anything about that. Aren't going to do anything about appealing to black voters and appealing to Hispanic voters. And I think Republicans will and are, and I think it's kind of an insult to Republicans to assume that we're not going to do anything about that. I mean, one of the interesting statistics that you read, not in Georgia, but in Florida, in the Florida governor's race last year, Ron DeSantis, the Republican candidate, got half of the non-Cuban Hispanic vote in Florida. And of course, way over half the Cubans, because the Cubans are, traditionally Republicans. But that was the margin of victory. That the Democrats assumed that the Hispanics would vote Democratic, and they didn't. And so, I think there's every opportunity for Republicans to make inroads, and I think we will. But demographics, I think, are driving the change in Gwinnett County, for example. To some extent in Cobb County, I think. It's not happening nearly as fast in Cobb, but I think it is. And in, demographics gave the Democrats a chance in North Fulton, in some legislative seats and in the congressional seat. And I think had we done a better job in the campaigns, I think we probably would have held the seats, but the demographic change gave them the chance.
Do you think increasingly, moving forward, Georgia is going to be a competitive purple state, is the term being thrown around, that the days of Democratic dominance, the days of Republican dominance are over, and it's going to be far more competitive from here on out?
I think that's probably true. And as a citizen, it's hard for me to say that's a bad thing. I mean, as a participant in elections, I was always like a basketball coach. I mean, you want to win every game.
Sure,
right?
sure.
But as a citizen, it's hard to say that it's a bad thing to have genuinely competitive elections where you really have an opportunity to hold the other side to account for what they're doing. I think the Republicans do a better job of running the state than the Democrats do. Does that mean that I think the Republicans never make mistakes? No, and Republicans can become too much like ends, just like the Democrats once did, and can deserve to be held to account for it. So, as a citizen, I really think one definition that somebody gave of a two-party system was that it's where one party is in and the other party is about to be in. And as a citizen, it's hard to say that's a bad thing.
Well, Bob, is there anything else we missed, or you want to get down in history for posterity here?
I don't know. We've talked about a lot of things.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Any other questions you want to ask?
Well, if there is, and I think of them later, I know how to get a hold of you.
There you go.
All right. Well, on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, Mr. Bob Irvin, thank you very much.
Thank you.